an isur, a prohibition in the Torah that's called Ever Min HaChai, which means the prohibition against eating a limb that is being taken from a living animal. We've spoken about treif, we're talking about basar min HaChai, which is meat, but not an entire limb. So we'll define that, and we'll talk specifically about that prohibition. And we'll talk about scenarios where one has not necessarily transgressed that prohibition. And although we're going to say you haven't transgressed that prohibition, it's certainly not something that is free of transgression. And again, it's certainly not something that's we're suggesting that somebody should be doing or is encouraged to do. So that's just a little bit of a disclaimer. And then we'll learn, as I hinted to in the little message we sent out before the shir today, about a very unusual scenario, which will actually impact a number of halachot in this chapter, of an animal that is completely kosher for consumption, but has never been shechted. Okay, so it's an interesting scenario that we'll learn about. Let me just get the page ready to share here. And we'll share my screen. I'm going to look away because then that's the way I can look at the screen. But we'll have it up. Okay, so here we are. The laws of ma'achalot asirot, forbidden foods, and chapter 5. So according to the oral tradition, oral law, we learned that the intent of the Torah statement, do not partake of the soul together with the meat, is to forbid a limb cut off from a living animal. With regard to a limb cut off from a living animal, it was said to Noach, so you must know that this is a prohibition that already exists as part of the 7 Noahide laws, but flesh together with its soul, its blood, you may not eat. Okay, a lot of the laws against some of these laws against eating blood and so on is actually in this week's parasha. But this is a particular prohibition about not eating a limb from a living animal. Prohibition against partaking a limb from a living animal applies to kosher domesticated animals, wild beasts, and fowl, but not to non-kosher species. Of course, eating from a non-kosher species is its own prohibition. So, not to suggest that if you're not transgressing this particular prohibition, that makes that allowed. Of course, that falls under its own category of prohibition. Excuse me. Okay, the term aver, which translates as limb, applies both to a limb that has flesh, sinew, and bones. For example, a hand or a foot, or an organ that does not have a bone. For example, the tongue, testicles, the spleen, the kidneys, the heart, and the like. There is, however, one difference. When an organ does not possess a bone, the prohibition against partaking of a limb from a living animal applies whether one cut off the entire organ or only part of it. And we'll talk this out. Where, by contrast, a limb possesses a bone, the person is not liable for violating the prohibition against the limb from a living animal unless he separates it in its complete state with its flesh, sinew, and bones. And we'll see it doesn't necessarily have to be the whole limb itself, but it has to have all those component parts of it. If, however, he only removes flesh from the living animal, he is liable for the prohibition against partaking of a treifa, as we explained, right? But not this particular transgression of Ever Min HaChai, a limb from a living animal. Halacha 3, one is liable for lashes. And when we say liable for lashes, that means he's transgressing a biblical prohibition, because we'll see soon that there are times when something is considered rabbinically prohibited under the broad category of Ever Min HaChai, but not biblically prohibited. So in this case, when is one actually transgressing the biblical prohibition? When have you actually transgressed? One is liable for lashes only for partaking of an olive-sized portion of a limb from a living animal. Even if one eats an entire limb or organ, if it is the size of an olive, one is liable. If not, he is exempt. So it has to be the full size. Now, if one cut off an olive-sized portion of flesh, sinew, and bone from the limb according to its natural form and ate it, one is liable, even if it possessed only the smallest amount of meat. So this is another point. It doesn't have to be necessarily meat alone to make up that kazayat amount, but even all together, those components make up that kazayat. If ever one separated a limb, which he tore off from a living animal and detached the flesh from the sinew and the meat, he is not liable for lashes unless he eats an olive-sized portion of the meat alone. So in other words, if you've taken off this limb and it has all these components, but you separate meat, then you'd have, even though the limb itself is more than a kazayat, you'd have to actually eat If you're eating the meat separately, then the meat alone would have to equal an olive portion for you to transgress and be liable for lashes for the Isser, for the prohibition of Ever Min HaChai. The bones and the sinews are not included in the olive-sized portion since he changed the limb's natural form. Now he just clarifies this. He says, when one divides this organ and eats it bit by bit, he is liable if there's an olive-sized portion of meat in what he ate. If not, he's exempt. If you took an olive-sized portion of a limb with flesh, sinews, and bones according to its natural form and ate it, he is liable even though it came divided inside his mouth before he swallows it. Because as long as the piece that you had was a kazayat, even if there wasn't that much meat, and even though it's breaking down once it's in your mouth, it's still considered that you have transgressed the full prohibition. Halacha 5. When a person rips a limb from a living animal and causes it to become treifa when doing so, he is doubly liable for partaking in it. Once for partaking of a limb from a living animal, once for partaking of a treifa. Both of these prohibitions take effect at the same time. In other words, what the Rambam is saying is, in a situation where it's already treif, you would have that prohibition in place. The one would supersede the other. But what he's saying is, this is a situation where both prohibitions take effect at the same time. And being that they both prohibitions take effect at the same time, you're liable for both. Similarly, if he rips fat, here we're talking about chaylev, the prohibited fat, from a living animal but takes of it, he is doubly liable, both for eating chaylev, which is the prohibited fat, and for eating the limb of the limb of a living animal. And the question of Yaz, he explains this also for partaking of a limb from a living animal and for partaking of fat. So the reason for this is you might say that chaylev, right, is a pre-existing prohibition, and surely that should kind of take precedent, and that's all you're liable for. So the explanation is because the prohibition of eating from a limb from a living animal is a broader prohibition. As we said above, this was something that was already given to Noach, so it would apply more broadly, and therefore both of these prohibitions are transgressed at that time. If he rips fat from a treifa animal, he is liable for the violation of 3 negative commandments. Again, because each particular prohibition affects a broader prohibition, and therefore for each one is liable. The halacha 6. The following rules apply when meat is disjoined from an animal and an organ is hanging from it. So here you're talking about where a limb is it's still attached, but it's hanging. If it is impossible that this meat will again become a living part of the body, it is forbidden. But one is not liable for lashes for it. So this is an example where, in other words, so now you eat it, but this is only a rabbinic prohibition of Ever Min HaChai. So you're not allowed to eat it, but you don't get lashes. This applies even though it was not separated from the animal until after it was slaughtered. So you're saying this is true even if, there's a limb dangling, then you shech the animal, but it was dangling while it was alive. So rabbinically, it's considered Ever Min HaChai. You don't eat it, even though you wouldn't get lashes if you did eat it. If the animal dies, so this is interesting, if it was dangling and then the animal dies, we consider the limb as if it fell off while the animal was alive. And if you then partake of that limb that was dangling, one receives lashes for partaking of it. Because the prohibition against partaking of a limb because of the prohibition against partaking of a limb of a living animal. If ever the limb could again become a living part of the body and the animal is ritually slaughtered, it is permitted. So I don't know exactly what the scenario would be, but if there's a limb hanging, if you shechted it, that particular thing you can't eat. If it died, not only can't you eat it, but if you did, you would be liable for lashes. If ever somehow it could regenerate, it could heal, that wouldn't be a problem at all. And once it's shechted, it would be fine. Now, we've discussed a couple of scenarios where you've taken off an external limb, or you've cut off a piece of an external limb of the animal. As we mentioned in the opening halakha, that the idea of Ever Min HaChai is both applies to limbs that have bones and limbs that don't have bones, and we gave examples of internal organs. So he says here, if one pulled an organ from its natural position, crushed it, ground it, for example, one crushed testicles or pulled them from their place, but they remained in place, and then slaughtered the animal, the organ is not forbidden according to scriptural law. Sorry, I went ahead of the game. We'll come back to the idea of actually ripping off an internal organ. Here he says that basically, so if you crush something but it remains in place, So it's not forbidden according to scriptural law. In other words, as not part of this prohibition. The rationale is that it possesses a trace of life, as evidenced by the fact that it does not decay. Again, so we're assuming that part of the body might have been completely messed up, so to speak, but it's not decaying. So it still is living off the life of the body. So it's not like it's being removed from the body. So if it's shechted, you would not transgress this prohibition. Nevertheless, it is forbidden to partake of it as a result of a custom followed by the entire Jewish people from previous generations. In other words, if someone's damaged an internal part of the animal, even though it's considered part of it still because it's not going to decay, and you shecht it, practice is that we don't eat it, even though it's not part of the biblical prohibition. For it resembles a limb separated from a living animal. And that would be the reason why we don't do it. Halacha 8. The following law applies when an animal's bone was broken. So this is where there's an exposed bone on the animal. I'm going to give a bit of a description of what it looks like. So if the flesh or the skin covers the majority of the thickness of the bone, of the broken bone, and the majority of the circumference of the fracture, it is permitted. It's still, in other words, still considered connected. It's part of the animal. If the bone emerged outside the skin, then the limb is forbidden. That part of it that's exposed. When the animal or fowl is slaughtered, one should cut off the limb at the place where it is broken and discard it. The remainder of the limb is permitted. So that part that was exposed is prohibited and discarded. The rest would be fine. We rule that the limb is forbidden until the flesh is healed in all the following situations. Say, I'm not so familiar exactly what this looks like in practice. It sounds a little bit gory, but he says if the bone broke, and like this, the flesh covers the bone, but that flesh was crushed or decayed, like flesh which a doctor would remove. It is scattered in many different places. That's the way it looks. If there were many perforations within the flesh, or the flesh was cracked or pierced like a ring, or the flesh was rubbed off from above until only a thin peel remained, or the flesh began decaying from below, in other words, from the bone around the broken bone to the extent that the flesh surrounding the bone does not touch it. So if a person partook of the limb in any of these circumstances, he is liable for lashes for rebellious conduct. So again, this is a rabbinic prohibition. That means the limb is exposed. It's still attached. It's not completely considered Eiver min HaChai from a biblical perspective. But if the meat on that bone represents any of this, what we've described over here, rabbinically it's considered a prohibition under this broad category of Eiver min HaChai, and you would get rabbinic lashes. Okay. So even though you're not transgressing the biblical prohibition. Halacha 9. When a person inserts his hand, so this is now what I was referring to earlier, this is where you actually detach an internal organ. When a person inserts his hand into the inside of an animal, cuts off the spleen, one of the kidneys, or the like, but leaves the severed organ inside the animal and then slaughters it, the pieces cut off are forbidden as organ from a living animal, although they remained within the animal's womb. Okay? If, however, you cut away a portion of the fetus within the womb, but did not remove it, and then slaughters the mother, the pieces or limbs of the fetus are permitted because they do not emerge outside the mother. Okay, so we're going to learn a whole bunch of halachot now that are really based on a principle that comes right at the end of this chapter, which is what I teased out a bit earlier, and that is like this, that if you shecht a cow and there is a fetus within the cow, you do not have to shecht that fetus in order to eat it. It's kosher as is. Obviously, it needs to be killed before you eat it, but it doesn't need to be shechted. Okay, so now he has a situation where a person sticks their hand into the womb of a cow and severs a limb of the fetus. Again, this is a bit grotesque. I'm not sure how this would be done or why it would be done, but again, we're testing these scenarios to clarify the principle. The principle is that it's not considered part of the mother, it's considered within the mother. And therefore, it would be considered kosher, so long as none of those limbs, as we'll see now, actually emerged from the mother while it was still alive. So now we go into something else. When a fetus sticks its foreleg or hind leg out of the womb, okay, that limb is forbidden forever, whether one cuts off the limb before he slaughters the mother or afterwards. Even if it returns the limb to the womb of the mother, and afterwards the mother was slaughtered, or the fetus was born and lived for several years, that limb is forbidden as a treifa. The rationale is that all meat that emerged from its natural position is forbidden as flesh that was separated from a living animal. So that's interesting. If a part of the animal was emerged, that part it's considered that it's Eiver min HaChai. That part of the fetus can never be eaten. So whether you sever it when you see it coming out, or the fetus comes out complete once the mother has been shechted, that part of that fetus animal is no longer allowed, even if it's birthed and lives on its own. And he says this is derived from the phrase in the pasuk, meat from an animal that was mortally wounded in the field. Our sage extrapolated, when meat comes out to a place that is like a field for it, meaning it's no longer in its place where its life is, it becomes treifa, as we've explained. Halacha 10. When a fetus sticks out a portion of the limb and a portion remains within, so it's part of the leg, even if it's only the minority of it, the portion which emerged is forbidden and that which remained in is permitted. Okay, so we're just clarifying further the point that we made above. If you cut off the portion of the limb that emerged after it was returned within the animal was slaughtered, only that portion is forbidden. The remainder of the limb is permitted. But if he did not return it to the womb and it remained outside and he cut off there, the place where the cut off is, meaning the place of the limb opened there after the limb was cut off, is forbidden. Okay, unusual scenario, right? The animal sticks out a leg and then puts it back in. If you cut off that part of the leg within the womb, then just that part gets removed and it's treif, the rest of the animal is fine. But if you cut it off while the limb was extended, then the part that's exposed on the outside is also prohibited. You have to cut that off. Once the animal is now the mother's is shechted and so on. He must afterwards cut off this portion as well. This applies whether he originally cut off the portion of the limb before the mother was slaughtered or afterwards. Halacha 11. Whenever a limb emerges and is cut off before the animal is slaughtered while it is outside, it is considered a limb from a living animal, as we've said, and one is worthy of lashes for partaking of it. This applies even if the fetus dies before the mother is slaughtered. If it is cut off after ritual slaughter, one who partakes of it is not liable for lashes, even if it dies. If the mother dies and then one cuts off this limb, one who partakes of it is liable for lashes for the prohibition against partaking of a limb from a living animal. Halacha 12, the following rule applies when a fetus sticks out a limb and that limb becomes forbidden, and then the fetus is born. Okay? So in other words, so as we've said, right, once the limb's out, that limb is always forbidden. It's like an aver minachai. Now it puts it back in. So he has an additional law, which is interesting. He says, if it's female, this young calf that's born is female, we are forbidden to drink its milk because of an unresolved halachic question. What's the unresolved halachic question? For milk comes from all of the animal's limbs, and it is a limb which is forbidden. In other words, it's comparable to milk from a treif animal that has become mixed with milk from a kosher animal. Fascinating. Okay. When a person slaughters a kosher animal that is pregnant and discovers a fetus, so this is the halacha that these other halachot that we just learned are based on. It says when you slaughter a cow and it's pregnant, now you discover the fetus, whether that fetus is alive or dead, within the womb, the fetus is permitted to be eaten. Even the placenta is permitted to be eaten. We spoke previously about a placenta that's not permitted. So here, even the placenta is permitted. But the following rules apply. If a portion of the placenta emerged and then one slaughtered the mother, okay, so if the placenta was attached to the fetus that is now born, the portion which emerged is forbidden. That part of the placenta is forbidden. And the remainder is permitted. If it is not attached to the fetus, in other words, there's a placenta comes out and a fetus comes out, but they're not attached, it's forbidden in entirety, even though only a part of it had emerged previously. For perhaps the fetus that was in this placenta disappeared. Okay, there's this, I don't know how likely this is. Maybe it's very unlikely. It sounds very unlikely to me. But nonetheless, we don't know. This may be from a different fetus, basically. Or maybe the placenta of the fetus that is found in the womb disappeared. Needless to say, if a fetus is not found in the womb at all, the placenta is forbidden in its entirety. Okay, so the placenta is only permissible so long as it contains with the fetus. Otherwise, it's not if it had previously emerged somewhat from the womb. Halacha 14, if one finds a living fetus in the womb of a slaughtered animal, so we're going back to this point, even though it has been carried for 9 months. So we're not just talking about an unviable fetus. We're talking about an animal that's fully developed. And it's possible that it will live. It does not require ritual slaughter. Instead, it is acceptable because of the slaughter of its mother. But that's true so long as it doesn't actually step onto the ground. If it steps on the ground, it does require ritual slaughter. Okay? If a person rips open an animal, so you don't shecht it, but somehow you ripped the animal, or slaughtered an animal that was treifa and found a live fetus that had been carried for 9 months, so it's viable on its own, that fetus must be ritually slaughtered to be permitted. The slaughter of his mother is not effective. If the period of gestation was not completed, it is forbidden even though it is alive in the womb of the treifa animal. So then there's no way to make it kosher. Only if it's the gestation is completed and it can live on its own, then you can still shecht it. The rationale is that it is considered as one of the mother's limbs. So long as it's not viable on its own, it's just like one of the mother's limbs. Whenever an animal thrusts its head, so all the example of where the animal puts part of its body out, that portion will be treif. That's so long as it wasn't the head. But whenever an animal thrusts its head out of the womb and then returns it, and only afterwards its mother was slaughtered, the slaughter of its mother has no bearing on it. If its head has come out, it's considered separated, so to speak, from its mother, and it's considered as if it was born. It must be ritually slaughtered to be permitted, even if it is then retracted back into the womb and kind of lived out the rest of the pregnancy. Okay, I'll stop there. It's a relatively short chapter, and that brings us to the end of today's halach.